part of this. With respect to the grading, I've explained this before, I think, but I haven't explained it in a while. What I do is technically you are required to attempt every single assignment, okay? You gotta have something. And then what I do is I drop your lowest score, okay? And then I take the other scores and that becomes your average. Then I look at things like, um, you know, your attendance, notes that I might make on participation, things like that, and decide whether or not I can actually move your grade up a little more. Okay, so um, I always drop, I do this in every class I teach. If there are a variety of submitted assignments, I'll always drop the lowest grade. Because I think everybody's entitled to have at least one stinker where you just, it's like, I don't know what this shit is, but I got to turn in an assignment. Or you had a bunch of midterms going on, and you didn't have the energy you normally have, to put into an assignment. That's understandable. So I don't worry about that. And so, are there any other questions? By the way, I mean, what are we in, week 7? Is this week 7? We're almost done.
I have one question.
Okay.
For module 3, for the essay, are we analyzing all of the readings? I just wanted to double check, because for the first module, we analyzed 2 of the 4. So I just wanted to make sure, so I'm doing everything right.
Yeah, no, you don't have to do all of them. I was kind of vague on that. I said the readings. I might have mentioned in class, I honestly don't remember because I don't often go back and listen to classes again once we've done them, unless there's something I'm trying to verify. I would say try to get at least 2 of the readings.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there are only 3. Is that right? Yeah, so if you could do 2 of the 3, you're fine. You're fine. For this, are there any other questions? Any other questions about grading or assignments? Or
I had a quick question. It's not really pertaining to this class, but I've been trying to sign up for summer classes, and it says I need like a professor or teacher signature or something to do it.
You probably have to meet with your advisor and do an academic plan.
I feel like should I know who my advisor is at this point?
Yeah.
Okay, that's not good.
I can try and find out. Can I stop recording for a second? Zoom recording. See, now no one will ever know. What was Bill talking about? All right. Are there any other impossible to answer questions before we move on? Okay. All right. Once again, though, if you have assignments that are outstanding, turn them in. Don't assume that I won't accept them. Assume that I may deduct points if they're late. I'm less likely to do that if you've been keeping me posted and you've got, you've explained to me what the situation is and we've been able to kind of make an arrangement. Then I'm much less likely to do anything really harsh with your grade. Partly because if you give me good work, I don't really have any interest. Hey, there's a dog. I don't have any interest in punishing anybody. I very seldom punish my own kids. Why would I punish you? And they're not, like gangsters or anything. So I don't think I did too bad. All right. Can we talk about module 4? Is that okay now? Can we do that? Or should I just leave and you guys can talk amongst yourselves? All right. Kyle's like, yeah, go ahead and go. Kyle, you want to take it over?
Eritrea, colonialism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything's disappointing. This is the disappointment module. What we're going to be doing a little bit today, I'll give you a little flyover, and then next week we'll be doing the presentations. This module used to have 7 readings, 7 assigned readings, and I would have maybe combined a couple of them, stuff like that. I found that things have gone better this term when I've really reduced the readings, that you have fewer readings. Some of them are longer readings, but I think people start to get confused. The other thing was that I have this very interesting, for me, class on group politics in Africa dealing with an ethnic minority in Mauritania. But as soon as I started saying Umbororo and started talking about the Fulani and started talking about migratory peoples in West Africa, everybody just glazed and like they'd gone to hell. And I thought, how could you not be interested in this stuff? It doesn't matter. They're not. So I took that article out, even though it's useful in explaining some of the kinds of challenges this module is intended to address. So the one thing that is not profoundly explored here is ethnicity. I don't know why, but students did not do well with the readings, the assignments, or their discussions of ethnicity. I think that one of the things that's happened in the United States, and I see this also in the UK, is that we've developed some really strange ideas about ethnicity, such that, and yes, this does tie into colonialism. So I'm not on a tangent. I'm actually getting at this a little bit obliquely. It's this question of identity, and people, I think, are beginning to view ethnicity as a consequence of brutality and oppression instead of what it actually is, okay, which is human communities tied together by a shared history, a shared sense of origin, a shared language, okay, that need not involve oppression directed toward that group, okay. But part of what's happened, I think, for your generation in the United States, and again, I'm really noticing that with, I've got a couple of, it's kind of weird, but I got like a guitar student and another graduate student who I work with who are in the UK. And they're telling me the same thing with students in the UK. One of these people's a Brit, the other one's an American who's transplanted over there. I also hear this from my oldest boy who's in Ireland. There's a sense that ethnicity now means the people who have been screwed over by white people, and that's ethnicity. If you look at the new ethnic and racial studies program that's being proposed at SOU, that's a lot of what that program is. In fact, I'm going to do something here. Think I'm gutless? Then I'm more than happy to have them bring that to my special attention. But so that's what this unit used to be. I find it very difficult to teach that now, because the problem is it spins out of control very quickly into, sort of grievance studies. Okay, well, this is everybody who's got a grievance, and white people can't have a grievance, and things like that. I'm not interested. See, it's sort of like discussions of religion. I'm just not interested. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm saying I don't care. I don't feel comfortable living in a world where a self-righteous, overeducated person can come and try and school me on life, when they've done 30 years of it and I've done 60. I just don't buy that. I don't do that with you. Why would somebody want to do that with me? That's what I don't get. And so I've redone this particular module in this class, certainly I've done it every year that I've taught it, to try and find some way of reaching students to talk about the certain kinds of historical legacies and how they yield certain senses of possibility, certain trajectories of development, certain crystallizations of identity or absence thereof, okay? And I haven't had any luck. I just haven't, because I feel like I'm pushing against or pulling against a kind of inertial drag of what, for want of a better term, or the best expression I've ever heard is grievance studies, okay? I'm just gonna say straight up, I'm not interested, okay? I don't think that's relevant to what I'm trying to do here. What I do think is relevant, though, and the current kind of incarnation of this module, is to try to address the previous module questions that were raised about development, so-called. What development is, how best to pursue it, what the obstacles to that pursuit might be, and the extent to which those things can be situated in things like the construction of the so-called global South, or of the third world, or of the distinction of developing countries, and the implications of those things. The places in the world that the former president of the United States referred to as shitholes, okay? That's the sort of hammerhead, blockhead way of getting at something that clearly was not understood, which is, why are there different patterns, trajectories, manifestations of change over time. Let's just not even say development, let's just say change over time, okay? And what I want to suggest is that colonialism is an important component of that. It is not the only one, because one of the examples in this unit is a part of the world that, while it was for a time colonized, all right, had something else going on with it. It was much more complex, and that's the one on Eritrea. You know, parts of Eritrea and Somalia were colonized under the Italians, under the Italian fascists. And that's why there's a certain generation about my age of Eritreans who are educated, at least, you know, fairly well educated, who speak fluent Italian. People used to always wonder, why do those people speak Italian? Well, because they were an Italian colony. Okay. But there was also the situation of what was sometimes referred to, Ruth Eob, for example, Eritrean scholar of the Horn of Africa, referred to as the regional hegemony or an attempt at regional hegemony by Ethiopia. And you might ask yourself, well, how could such a pathetically weak country as Ethiopia aspire to regional hegemony? Okay. And, you know, the idea is that they had the backing of powerful countries. They had the backing of the UN. They had the backing of the United States. And one of the claims to fame of Ethiopia was, we're the only African country mentioned in the Bible. I mean, that actually, you know, as Abyssinia or whatever, that mattered. Okay. So there's an interesting history in the Horn of Africa that isn't just about white people exploiting non-white people. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's much more interesting than that. Caden, this is not a history of the Horn of Africa right now, so I can't get into that right now. But they're interesting questions, just that, you know, if I would be allowed to teach a class in African history, I could do that, but I'm not being encouraged to do that because there's no demand for it, unfortunately. Okay, so the idea here is, you know, first of all, if we talk about colonialism, okay, what do we mean by colonialism and why should it leave a legacy? Because after the Second World War, at least nominally, United States brokered this global, led by the Allies primarily, this global organization, creation of the United Nations. And the idea there was in the UN Charter. There were a couple of first principles, okay? And one of them was self-determination, the self-determination of peoples, okay? And the other one was territorial integrity. Now, the problem with self-determination and territorial integrity is that they immediately come into conflict, whether you intend them to or not. That's one of the things I want us to keep in mind here. Self-determination is the idea that a people ought to be able to choose their own destiny. They ought to be able to determine how they're going to live, you know, whether or not they're going to have a certain kind of educational system or, you know, a certain kind of economic structure or a certain kind of political system or whatever. That's supposed to be guaranteed in the UN Charter. Let me ask you this, though. If that's the case, and it is a part of the UN Charter, then why should we care how Afghanistan treats its own people? Because that's the issue right now with the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan and cutting a deal with the Taliban to do that. The Taliban, by the way, is pulling a lot of different chains right now because they're letting Afghanistan know there's a new sheriff in town as soon as the Americans get out of here, and they're leaving. And the rest of the multinational forces are going with them. But why should we care? What business is it of ours if they have a guaranteed right under the United Nations Charter to self-determination? But, you know, we can see our own human rights and values as something that others should have. They might too. Isn't that what Islamic State did? We want to assemble a pan-Islamic caliphate because our ideas and values are superior. What gives us the right to do that? The UN does not have a standing army, Caden. The UN cannot send forces anywhere because it has no standing army. And there is no great support right now for giving, you know, nuclear weapons to the blue helmets. You know, it's a fair question, but no, it did not.
No, it didn't.
No, the UN did not send troops to Yugoslavia and Rwanda. That's false. That's inaccurate. That's inaccurate. Multinational forces under a UN agreement agreed to deploy some of their military assets to the region. That's very different. And no, you have not been lied to. Someone has misunderstood that. The United Nations, in other words, none of those forces other than the policing unit were blue helmets. The American forces, when they were there, before they were unceremoniously removed by George W. Bush, were not wearing blue helmets. They were American forces. The high altitude bombers that we sent over that part of the world to drop, very, very dangerous high powered explosives, right? Those weren't painted blue. Those were American operations, okay? Coordinated in multinational forces. It's like in Afghanistan, that's a multinational force, or the invasion of Iraq, that was under a United Nations charter, okay? The British were kind of went into that with us. There was a nominal coalition of the willing, so-called, right? That wasn't a UN operation. It was a UN charter, but it was an American-led and coordinated operation. That had more to do with NATO than it had to do with the United Nations. Okay, but I don't want to get too far afield of this. I'm not asking whether or not we have the force capable of doing it. Why should we do it?
I guess there's, at least for America, there's this kind of theory of the need to free everybody around the world, some kind of weird sense of duty. Not really a civilizing mission, but something similar.
Well,
like a freedom mission of some kind.
But if the United States, if U.S. foreign policy is motivated by a freeing mission, a mission of liberation, then why have we so routinely and right up to the present day aligned ourselves with some of the most brutal and repressive regimes on the planet, including,
I mean,
for example,
pretending to
Saudi
be an
Arabia?
actually,
What?
yeah, you could, I don't know, how do I put this? There's an importance to present yourself as such.
So in other words, you have to be a good liar.
Yeah, I
Okay.
guess.
Kat's being very cynical today. But I don't think you're far wrong. She says it's business. The United States is business. The United States is not a business. The United States is a republic. However, the United States is a commercial republic. That's clear from the Constitution. And I think that's what you mean. And no, you're not being cynical. You're being wry, which is different and much more interesting. But that's right. And part of it is I hate the 21st century. There it is. I've said it. However, okay, this notion of branding really matters. And I think, Kyle, that's what you're talking about. We've branded ourselves as liberators, really starting with the Second World War. The difference is in the Second World War, you could make a compelling case for the United States military as an army of liberation. You really could. There has never been, in modern history at least, a time when the United States took on more aggressively the role of liberator than in the Second World War. We didn't do it in the First World War because that was not a war for liberation. That was not a war against fascism or anything like that. That was an old school Napoleonic style war. Okay, that had nothing to do with freedom. Okay, it had everything to do with the balance of power in Europe. That's not about freedom. Okay, but we could argue that going to war against fascism was going to war against a political model, a political type that atomized or negated completely the concept of individual liberty or freedom of movement or any of the concepts of freedom that we think about. Okay, but that's not what we're talking about with Afghanistan. If they decide, no, we want to live like it was 500 years ago, what business is that of ours? And Kat would suggest, because it's business. Well, that's right. And that's why in March of his first couple of months in office, shortly before 9/11, with every reason to believe that what ultimately happened could happen, the George W. Bush administration made a $40 million loan, really, a $40 million deal involving essentially a loan, right, to Afghanistan under the Taliban, knowing what the Taliban was. Okay, here's a deal, because we want to have this pipeline. And the Taliban's like, it'll cost you 40 big ones. Okay, here's 40 big ones. This was in March of 2001. By September, Afghanistan is so repellent that we have to invade them and squash them. Now, what changed? It was, you know what it wasn't? The Taliban. You know what it wasn't? Concern about women and girls going to school. Because if it was, why did we give that regime $40 million? Yeah, we did squash them. We didn't defeat them, but we crushed the very things that we thought we were defending. You know, we took a failing state and crushed it. I mean, that's history. Okay. And out of it, you know, years later, we got the corpse of Osama bin Laden. That seems to be about all we got from that. We were in that war, you know, we were involved in there, because of course it wasn't a declared war, longer than any other military adventure in American history. Longer than Vietnam. Not nearly as many casualties, fortunately, but longer than in Vietnam. But here's the thing with, this is why, you know, this idea of attempts at colonialism or legacy or history or internal governance and things like that. Afghanistan has been the source of that kind of warfare for centuries. You can go back to the beginning of the 19th century, and there was a tension. At that time, the tension was between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. And one of the areas where they were going to fight it out was Afghanistan. You'll hear it referred to in history as they call it the Great Game. And it was this is where modern espionage was really born. This is why Afghanistan is referred to as the graveyard of empires. People have been fighting to gain control of that part of the world for 1,000 years, and they've never succeeded. No one's ever succeeded. Okay. And so when that's your history, it's going to give you a certain view of the world. And in this case, the view of the world it seems to give, at least to rural people in Afghanistan, is nothing's changed in 500 years. And where it has, it's been because people from outside have come in and tried to take our sovereignty away from us. And you're talking about a part of the world where there's a large cohort of people who have lived for generations, as far back as any of them can calculate, within 20 miles of where they now live. Okay. You can't say that of anybody in America anymore. You used to be able to say that of a lot of people in the Deep South, but I don't think you could say that of even that many Southerners anymore. Because the South, it was just more, there was a sense there of more of a sense of being tied to the land. But one of the things that we forget is the importance of identity being tied to history and shared history and being tied to territory. We are the people of this territory. There's a lot of that in Afghanistan. It's ours. Go away. It isn't we want to conquer the world or we want you to live like us. I guarantee you, there aren't 7 people in Afghanistan who care at all the way the rest of the world lives with respect to this. They just want to be left alone to live the way they want to live. Okay. Why do they want to live so differently from the way we want to live? Because they have a completely different history. Okay. But it's not just a history of them being the victims of oppression. This is one of the most, sort of relentlessly violent and unstable parts of the world. Okay. And there are a lot of people in Afghanistan who kind of wouldn't have it any other way because it's them fighting over their own destiny. And this has gone on for generations. And when these big empires come in, whether it's Britain or Russia or the Soviet Union or the United States, they're like, you're not going to make it. And no one ever has. No one ever has been able to stay because they don't want us there. Okay? They don't want us there. And so then the idea is what? Well, there's a very powerful sense of identity tied to place in Afghanistan. Americans don't really have that. Most Americans don't understand that. because we don't have that passionate sense of being tied to a place in the same way. Because, I don't know, going back more than about 2 generations, where any of my ancestors lived other than reservations, on my mother's side. Okay, but and again, that wasn't their land anymore. That was taken away from them. So I'm completely cut off from that. So are a lot of you. You don't have that same sense of identity tied to place. So then the question is it a sense of identity tied to blood? Is it what's referred to in ethnic studies as primordial ties? Okay. What might that expression mean? What does the expression primordial mean? When we're thinking about identity, you will hear primordial used a lot of times in terms of archaeology, prehistory.
Like beginning of times kind of thing?
Yeah, as far back as at the beginning, and the idea of primordial ties in terms of human identity is as far back as these people can reason. They've been a people, It doesn't mean that they're all the same. That's what a lot of people misunderstand. It means that there's a strong sense of bond between these people, okay, that they trace back as far as they're able to. And that's a sense of shared history and shared identity because of it. Often it includes things like, a shared language, okay. Language is one of the most important components of ethnic identity, okay. All right, so where does colonialism fit into all this? You got these primordial ties and these people who've been living the way they've been living maybe for as long as any of them can remember, they migrated from somewhere to somewhere. Maybe they still migrate, but let's talk about people who begun to settle in a general, usually in a valley with a river running through it. It's the perfect place for human beings. A little bit of grass, not too tall, some trees, very safe environment, okay, savanna, okay. And then all of a sudden, here come rolling in these other people, telling them, okay, this is ours. Hello, here we are, here's the flag, we own all of this, by the way. Or they'll come in and they'll say, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to let you be friends of the empire, whatever the empire is, if you'll just sign this piece of paper. You're illiterate, of course, but that's all right, And this is the way, for example, that most of sub-Saharan Africa was colonized. These were private, Kat sort of jokingly said, oh, the United States is a business. Well, the people who went in and the organizations who went in and colonized much of sub-Saharan Africa, they were businesses. They were. But they included businesses like the East India Company. The East India Company had its own army, its own military, and it was formidable. It had its own navy, okay? And so the idea was, we're going to do this just like a business. The real beginnings of this might have been East Africa, because you had some wonderful arable land. You had some highlands that were a little more hospitable, get you up out of the tropical belt and things like that. That weather, I don't know how many of you have ever lived in the tropics, but boy, if you're not used to that, it is debilitating. So if you've got a place like Kenya, Tanzania, some parts of Uganda, you can get up into the highlands, where you can grow tea and coffee, and you can get, temperate climate and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's pretty desirable to people who aren't from that place, Europeans, right? And so the idea of colonialism is, what we'll do is we'll come in. We've done some preliminary exploration. Thank you, Portugal. You brutal people, you. And Portugal had essentially sort of circumnavigated sub-Saharan Africa. They'd gone on, but they'd never gone in very far at all into the interior because, in terms of the landscape and everything, it was really daunting. And it was not a comfortable place for Europeans. Okay. But they did map the coastal areas, and they knew where, the safe ports were, deep water ports, where they, so in other words, in terms of trade and commerce, just the ocean around, sub-Saharan Africa is just, it's a vital sea lane, okay? Gradually, of course, you encounter the people who already live there. They're in the way of what you want to do because, as Kat suggested, it ain't personal, it's a business. Then, of course, primarily initially Portugal, later on virtually every European power discovered the people there can be a business, okay, as various kinds of labor initially, right? And we're not just talking about slavery, okay? We're talking about cash crop agriculture too, the idea of going in and saying, oh no, we don't have slaves anymore. We've done away with slavery. Let's say, middle of the 19th century for the rest of the civilized world, the United States a little later. But we'll pay you to work on these plantations. But it means you can no longer maintain the farms on which you grow food to feed your families. What we need you to do is go work in these, these rubber plantations. Let's say it's Liberia, or these plantations, that produce palm oil or whatever, or one of your colleagues and I were talking about this earlier today. This is called cash crop agriculture, agriculture for export economies, primary production. This was all created by colonialism, okay? And this is why in the last unit that we had, we were talking about dependency and development. The process of creating those dependent relationships and underdevelopment was colonialism. That's what created, according to the dependency theorists, it was a direct byproduct of centuries of colonialism, both in Latin America, in Central and South America, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in parts of Asia, but although that works a little differently. So the idea with colonialism here, and this notion of colonialism and development, is that there are plenty of scholars, and not just dependency theory scholars, and not just left-wing scholars, who suggest that if we want to understand the relatively persistent limitations on growth or development or whatever the Western criteria are for success in parts of the world, you don't need to look any further than the legacy of colonialism. It's not an excuse for it, it's an explanation for it. Okay. So again, this is not to give moral support to a people or to give them sympathy or to wave away any of their responsibility, but to say they did not start from the same place. Even the United States, a lot of people say, well, the United States started out as colonies. No, it didn't. Okay. No, not in the sense that, Southeast Asia did parts of it, or almost all of Sub-Saharan Africa, or almost all of Central and South America. It did not start out as that kind of colony. In fact, what you can think of is that, this is what the important distinction, the colonized people were displaced. They were just displaced. So in the case of the United States, we're not talking about colonialists. We're talking in the sense of the people being colonized, right? We're talking about the colonizer. The people who prevailed in the United States were the colonizers, not the colonized. Okay, so that model does not fit with this legacy of colonial, underdevelopment or whatever, because the colonizers prevailed. We either displaced or exterminated the original inhabitants of the United States. I mean, if you want to look at the colonized peoples, then, the best way to study that at SOU is take a class from Brooke Colley and, Chance Whiteeyes. And they'll talk to you about the colonized people in the United States, okay? So the model of colonialism was not designed as a model of development of the colonized. That's an important distinction. It was created to advance the interests of the colonizer. And those were quite distinct from the interests of the colonized. First of all, obviously, the colonized, for the most part, had no vested interest in being colonized. It wasn't like people were sitting around thinking, gee, I wish someone would come over here who had an extraordinary military advantage, stick that military advantage in our faces and say, now you work for us. Wouldn't that be swell? See, that never happened to what are now Americans, the successful, in quotes, Americans. We're the colonizers. We're not the colonized, Okay, that doesn't, by the way, make any of us bad people. That's not what I'm talking about. I think that's where this argument often spins out of control, which is the idea that somehow you all should feel a sense of self-loathing because you're descended, most of you at least, from the colonizers. All of you in one way or another, really, all of us. Well, yeah, of course we are. You know, some of us have descent, have lines of descent with the colonized as well. That doesn't make us any more noble, though. Okay, for a couple of reasons. The argument that says before colonialism, everything was great is a bullshit argument. It's garbage. Everything wasn't great in North America before Europe came here. There were wars in the Western Hemisphere long before Europeans ever came here. There was slavery in the Western Hemisphere long before Europeans ever came here. There was human sacrifice. Okay. There was violence against women. There was exploitation of children. All those things existed before Europeans ever even knew that the Western Hemisphere existed. So this argument that somehow colonialism was like this killer virus that came into these beautiful, noble, pristine societies and corrupted or destroyed all of them, that is complete nonsense. It's not an intellectually valid argument, and it's ahistorical. It doesn't follow the legitimate trajectory of history. And like most bullshit arguments, the truth is much more interesting. It's just not as simplistic. Okay. So the idea of colonialism is, let's understand what the real nature of the colonial legacy was. Let's not look at it moralistically. Let's try and just look at it empirically. What can we observe, and how can we interpret that? Our own interpretation is going to be biased? Of course they are. Everybody's are. But to the extent that we aspire to be objective and that we're self-aware enough to know, well, maybe that's my predisposition as an American or a European descended person or something. Maybe that's my bias. I should be aware of that. That's one thing. But just to decide, European colonialism was a uniform program of extermination of nominally inferior peoples is nonsense. Because that's not business. And Kat's right. It was business. Okay. Which in some ways makes it even more sinister. It wasn't a deliberate attempt to exterminate. The idea was, well, if that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. That's different from, okay, I want you to go in there and eliminate everyone. That's war, And no one ever said that was nice. All right, so the first thing that I want you to start thinking about as you're going through the literature, when people are talking about colonialism, what are they talking about? And what are they not talking about? Okay, so don't just take a facile, superficial notion of colonialism and set it out there when you're reading about colonialism. Think really hard about the history of colonialism, and particularly of European colonialism. I would suggest to you, for example, that when we talk about the concept of race, throughout human history, we were aware of how we looked differently and how each, from people to people. We were aware of that. What we didn't do was put much in it. Because where there were tribal distinctions, for example, those weren't just superficial distinctions of the same people living in different places. We're talking about mutually unintelligible languages, experiences of the world and its history that were incompatible one with another. These were meaningful differences, okay, that sometimes led to war, but not always. They often led to peace through intermarriage, just like Europeans, right? All of this stuff was happening in those parts of the world that were going to be colonized by Europe from let's say, the 17th through the 20th century, okay? A lot of those same things were happening. They were happening in sub-Saharan Africa. They were happening in Southeast Asia. They were happening, in parts of Latin America, whatever, before they were those things. So, but the notion of colonialism is it did, among other things, create and give valence to this concept of race. It's a lot easier to dominate people. It's a lot easier to see them as a factor of production instead of displaced human beings when you look at it as a business and you think you've got science on your side. And you've cooked up a science that says that they are inferior. Okay. That hadn't ever really been done before. Okay. The notion of white man's burden, that specifically, I believe the phrase originates with Rudyard Kipling, but I could be wrong. I might be spacing on that. There was another imperial poet of that generation who may have originated the white man's burden notion. But it was that idea that if you look at early anthropology, okay, was all premised on this idea of the superiority of Europeans, and particularly of Northern Europeans, and more particularly of the English. Okay, you'll see this reflected in, you know, Sherlock Holmes and any number of other places where there's this kind of nonsensical anthropology that suggests that people with long, narrow heads were inherently superior to people with rounder heads and goofy stuff like that. That was considered science into the 20th century. It was clearly not. It was clearly a distortion of the scientific method in order to validate a necessary sense of superiority that in turn justified the British Empire and all the depredations it visited upon the rest of the world. Okay. So the notion of colonialism is that you impose alien rule. Okay, you take advantage. This was in the decolonization class that I taught earlier this year. You take advantage of this asymmetry, this technological asymmetry. It doesn't mean that you're superior. It means, though, that you have an asymmetrical advantage in those areas that allow you to dominate. And they're almost always industrial, okay? They're technological, let us say. You have superior weapons. You have superior mobility. What you don't often have is superior resistance to disease. What you sometimes do have, though, is disease that you bring with you that to which the indigenous inhabitants have no resistance. I mean, there are a lot of ways that colonialism can lay waste to territories. John Winthrop apparently wrote back to England during the settlement of the Mayflower colony, thanking God for sending ahead of them the scourge of smallpox, so that it would depopulate, the areas they wanted to settle, and give. He even used, I believe, the expression, and it was God giving them clear title to the land. Okay, I mean, those are the kind of people who settled the United States. So there you go. But again, it's that idea of superiority. The people who were here died because it was God's will, because they didn't deserve what they had, because they couldn't make productive use of it. Well, they were already making productive use of it. Thank you very much. But part of this notion of colonialism is who writes the history, who establishes and records the narrative. That's an important legacy of colonialism. If you established an educational system that propagates a certain colonial myth in the form of history, you're going to socialize and intellectualize a generation among the colonized who are going to identify with that because their education is a privilege, okay? And maybe the social stature that they achieve as a consequence of that education gives them elite status among their own people, okay? They're more likely to carry that narrative with them, okay? This can create the kind of tensions that lead not only to anti-colonialism, but to the subsequent persistence of instability, violence, and civil war even after colonialism. That's all a legacy of colonialism. The favoring of one ethnic group over another, often but not always, was either exploited by a colonial regime where it wasn't actually manufactured by it. It's a complex history. So think about this notion of colonialism, the colonial legacy, and development. That's what that first article is about, okay? Any questions so far? Are there no questions because you have no idea what I'm talking about? Kat, did you?
I have a question.
Okay, Kendall.
Earlier in the conversation, you were talking about self-determination versus something else and how they contradict each other, but I don't think we got
Territorial integrity.
Thank you. I just wanted to write it down.
Again, where is there territorial integrity when there's colonialism? There isn't. Okay. But beyond that, if Afghanistan has territorial integrity, within which its people can choose the right to self-determination, what are we doing invading Afghanistan after 9/11? Afghanistan did not fly those planes into the towers. They didn't. That's a fact on the ground. Because these things are complicated, all right? So the idea is that tension between, well, we have a right to self-determination. On the other hand, we're guaranteed territorial integrity. The right to self-determination is what led to the breakup of Yugoslavia, okay, where you had all kinds of ethnic groups fighting after Tito died, because Tito was holding together Yugoslavia almost by force of will by then, and doing so rather successfully, really. He dies, and subsequently we see people who nominally are on the same side, who very cynically mobilize people from their own region of the country to despise one another. The popular media portrayal of the breakup of Yugoslavia was, well, these people have been fighting one another for 1,300 years. No, they hadn't. No, they hadn't. That's nonsense. The Serbs had not been at war with Croats for 1,300 years. They had not been carrying out genocide against one another for 1,300 years. They had not been butchering one another for 1,300 years. They hadn't. Okay? In fact, under Tito and with the creation of Yugoslavia after the Second World War, they'd been living together remarkably peacefully. Okay. But it was weird the way Western media picked up on this magic number 1,300 years. Well, they've been at it. I'm going to argue it's a legacy of the colonial mentality that says, see what happens when you give people, their own determination. They can't govern themselves. They're just butchers. They're not like us. They're not real Europeans. And you heard, at least in subtext, a lot of that kind of nonsense in the 1990s with the breakup of Yugoslavia. And that was stunning to a lot of people, because that was a war between Europeans on European soil, something we hadn't seen since the Second World War. There had to be a way to frame it. It couldn't possibly be that Europeans had finally realized they were superior to war. Well, they're not real Europeans. They're Serbs and Croats, and some of them are Muslims. I mean, there are all of these ethnic justifications used. They've been like this for 1,300 years. It's their nature. I heard a university professor say that. It's their nature. They're warlike. What are you buying your PhDs these days? But you'd hear that, right?
So all these ethnic things came into place, like racism, right? They only came into place to justify why they were colonizing to make profit off of what they have on their land.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. So you're saying that these were just arguments to justify why they were colonizing them, right?
Yeah. What I'm not saying is that suddenly human beings started looking at each other, realizing their differences, and decided they hated each other. I'm not saying that. That is part of the human condition. All of us are much more likely, and it appears to be instinctive, that we're much more likely to be drawn to people who we perceive as being more like us. It's a security mechanism. It's a survival mechanism. It is primordial, okay? But, and people have fought wars against people who had different languages and different customs and looked different and things like that. But nobody ever bothered to try to make a science of it. But particularly the expansion of the British Empire, the logic of that was this kind of civilizing mission toward the rest of the world, right? We're propagating these higher values. And one of them, of course, was, the purifying rationality and reason of science and all that. Yeah, but you're exterminating people. Well, but they're not really, and here's why. And so they developed this complex architecture of race and racial hierarchy, not just racial types, but racial hierarchy. Yes. Is that what you're asking? Those were artificial constructs that were not borne out by science, but overwhelmingly did provide intellectual cover, both for Britain and for the United States. I mean, the first compelling movement for eugenics, for example, for sort of sterilizing or otherwise getting rid of, inferior people, was in the United States. The Nazis studied that before imposing those same practices in Nazi Germany. mean, there were prominent American intellectuals who propagated that idea of a kind of part of it was a legacy of the racial hierarchy. Okay, but this idea that there is a natural hierarchy of a genetically determined hierarchy. There was still a great belief in the early 20th century of, kind of, it's funny, in my terrorism class, it was there too, this idea of positivism. There are criminal types and you could recognize them by looking at them and things like that. I mean, that stuff was American too. And a lot of people still believe that stuff, All right, so that's the first thing then. Think about colonialism. But again, I'm not interested in this argument about evil Europeans coming in and being mean to everybody. I think it's a lame ass argument. I don't think it helps us understand anything. I think the more apropos, I think that the more cogent argument is it's business, okay? But it's business that costs people their lives and their histories and their identities, okay? And not just because of Europeans, okay? A great, sort of wiped away part of that history is the willing compliance of West Africans to engage in, for example, slave trade, or to engage in European wars and things like that, because they stood themselves to gain. All right, the notion of this despotism and deferred development is somewhat different. The argument of that's a draft of a paper that blew up like a nuclear weapon when I submitted to Africa Today. And even though I didn't intend that at all, I was given a weekend to write a reflection on 25 years after Eritrean independence. I wrote that. I didn't even have a chance to really proof it. And a lot of scholars from the Horn, they saw the last name and assumed, okay, this is a white imperialist, imposing the imperial critique on us. No, Eritrea is a butcher shop. It's a shit zone. It's hell on earth. It absolutely is. Not because they can't govern themselves, but because they chose to govern themselves in the way they did. Okay. This is an idea where Eritrea had, and I try to explain this in the article, there was extraordinary optimism. I mean, I felt it. Everybody of the people who were concerned about the Horn from my generation, we were so excited for the possibilities for Eritrea. Once, after 30 years of war with Ethiopia, that was done. Very few people were cynical enough at the time to anticipate that the EPLF might go in the direction that it went, which was this brutal, hyper-militarized absolutism. I didn't. I mean, that was the last time I behaved in an idealistic way, was support for the EPLF. So, full disclosure, I was a supporter of the EPLF. I that was one of those rare times when my normal propensity for objectivity was just gone. I was as close to being a true believer as I could be in anything, because they had struggled so hard and the potential was so strong, and I was surrounded by EPLF people and their apologists, and that was the only version of the story I was getting, okay, because I couldn't get into the country. Very quickly, though, they abandoned everything they had purported to fight for other than independence and self-determination. They had come up with a kind of a charter, a declaration of principles that you'll see described there. They almost immediately abandoned almost every one of them, okay? They never demobilized. And for people who had been, who all their lives, all they had ever known was wearing, that light camouflage, desert camouflage fatigue of the EPLF. They were done fighting. They didn't want to fight anymore. They were kept in the military. People who had been supporting the EPLF from around the world and the Eritrean diaspora were suddenly realizing, there's something really wrong here. So that's an attempt to kind of look at 25 years later, what did that lead to? I can understand people disagreeing with the conclusions such as they are. I don't think they're particularly harsh, really. I don't think they're optimistic, but it's not like I'm saying these are animals who can't govern themselves. I'm saying, oh no, they're doing a perfectly good job of governing themselves. This is just not what they told everybody they were going to do. So the question is why, you know? So that's what that is. And part of it is what I'm suggesting here, and the reason why I include that in this unit is this is one of the strategies that has been chosen from time to time by countries who struggled for a very long time for independence and finally achieved it, which is whatever you may think of us, we're going to carve our own path and we're going to do it our way, and we don't care what you think about it. Okay, this was Cuba, you know, after the revolution. It was like, look, United States, you know, we don't really care what you think. They didn't even really care what Russia thought, what Soviet Union thought. They just initially, that revolution was for Cuba and Cubans. It wasn't part of, you know, a desire to affiliate with the Soviet Union at all. And so the same thing kind of, we see that a little bit here. Besides Afwerki, who remains the head of state, you know, almost 30 years later, has very strong ties to China now, and to a model of Marxism-Leninism that looks Paleolithic now. It looked kind of clunky 30 years ago. Now it absolutely looks, you know, it looks Neanderthal, you know, but that's what they chose. The people who controlled the country chose that path. In other words, nobody was standing on the border with guns telling them. Nobody was coming in and exploiting them as a post-colonial power and saying, okay, we're going to underdevelop you. You have to do this. These were decisions they made. Okay. And then the last article is this discussion of what is meant, you know, by the global South. So a lot of that is the global South is generally that part of the world that had been colonized up until 1945 or thereabouts. So let's say till 1975. Recently emerging independent societies and economies, okay? And so that article is there mostly just to give you some explanation of what is this term global South and what does it mean? You know, what is the developing world? What does that mean? But remember that this notion of global South, that's a model of how to look at the world. It doesn't mean it's the only way, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way, okay? Technically, I suppose Eritrea, for example, would be considered part of the global South. It's an open question as to whether or not they see themselves that way. You know, because part of that, again, it's this idea of you put us, you know, powerful Western countries, you put us in this category, global South, third world, developing world, whatever. You put us there. You made those categories up. We didn't. You know, that's powerful. As potentially a determinant of economic, in quotes, progress. It's like when you're kids, if your parents are encouraging to you, I don't mean that everything you do is a great job, but I mean they're like behind you and they're like trying to get to know you as human beings instead of making you little surrogates of themselves. And they're not hyper judgmental, but they're trying to correct rather than judge and condemn you. You're going to grow up differently, all things being equal, than if your parents are very repressive and tell you this is the way the world is, here it's in this book, or here it's on this TV show, or whatever it is. I mean, you're going to grow up differently. Again, all of the things being equal. Well, it's the same thing with countries as they emerge. I mean, the United States essentially was born into relative privilege by comparison to human experience, right? In other words, we had this incredibly resource-rich environment. We had all of the industrializing energy of Europe, which we stole blindly and then improved upon, okay? That's how we built the industrial apparatus of the United States, thievery, you know, of course. There was innovation here, but there was a tremendous amount of theft. We were the China of the 18th century and early 19th century. We were China. You know, oh, you don't respect our, you know, our property, or you don't respect our patents or whatever. No, we didn't. You know, we stole things and we made them better. We stole from Britain, we stole from Germany, we stole from whoever had the cool stuff. And then we did improve upon almost all of it, okay? But that's not the same thing as being born, you know, on the wrong side of the tracks, the way much of the so-called global South or developing world has been, okay? So that's what that's about. How many of you have heard the term Global South? Okay, good. All right. When you think of that,
Heard
what do you?
it, but I've never known what it means.
Okay, well, hopefully that article will help you with that. Let's see, where'd Shelby go? You just had your hand up. You do have your hand up again, Shelby.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Okay, good. Is that all you wanted? Emma, is that the same with you? You just wanted to indicate, yeah, I've heard of the term?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that you might not have had a follow-up comment or question. That's what happens when I can't see you. You know, I'm not sure what's going on. But anyway, most of you are familiar with the term. So what I want you to do is that article should give you a little bit of detail and a little bit of here's how, as a model of the world, here's why that's still important. Here's why that still matters. Again, feel free to disagree with it, but make sure before you decide to judge it or condemn it or agree with it, that you understand what the authors are trying to say in all of those. Now, so do you get a sense of what the tone of this module is? It's like, you know, in relatively uncompromising terms, let's look as clearly as we can at the legacy of colonialism, the questions of identity, you know, largely exacerbated or enhanced by that or distorted by that, the notion of self-governance and the problematic nature of self-governance in the Global South and things like that. We need some presenters.
Would I be able to present on the Global South?
Okay, I'm gonna put you down for that right now. Sorry about the clatter. Okay, what about colonialism and development?
I do colonialism and development. Okay. If anyone wants to join me, of course, that's totally fine with me. If somebody wanted to like expand on it.
Now remember that I would prefer that you not do more than 2 presentations for credit, because you have to do 2 written assignments. And Shelby, that wasn't directed at you. That's just more broadly directed to the class.
Oh no, yeah, I got it. But yeah, this would be my second presentation. So
okay, for those of you who've done a couple and you're willing to write on this, but you still, you know, you think that maybe sometimes people find that preparing for the presentation draws them into the material in a way that's better than just writing about it. So I'm more than happy to let you do that. Okay, what about the one on despotism and deferred development?
I can do that one.
Okay.
Can I jump in on the colonialism and development with Shelby?
Sure. All right. Anybody else? I mean, we've got at least one person for each of, excuse me, for each of the articles. Was there anybody else who wanted to present? All right. So then I think we are ready for next week. Unless you have any other questions, I will see you next week for presentations. Okay?
Okay.
All right.